Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout New Vegas, where today we're going to be taking a look at the Recharger Rifle, which is one of the early game laser weapons, sort of. It's sort of a laser weapon. The Recharger Rifle could be one of the very first energy weapons that you find, as you can find this on Dead Blight members. You could also find it from vendors that might sell it, like Chet. Chet can often have a Recharger Rifle as well. The Recharger Rifle is pretty unique in that it is a weapon that does not require any sort of ammo. You just have to wait for it to charge up, and then you can fire it until it's empty, and you'll have to wait for it to charge back up again. For the base stats of the Recharger Rifle, this one requires 0 energy weapons and 5 strength. The strength requirement is kind of high for an energy weapon. Most energy weapons do not require 5+ strength. Some of them do, like the Gatling laser and the plasma caster, but most of them are generally around like 3 to 4 strength, so this one's a little bit heftier than others. That being said, most characters are probably going to go with 5 strength minimum or a bit higher than that, depending on what type of build or weapons you're going to be using, unless you're running a specific build. So it's by no means unreasonable. Most characters are going to be able to use this right away. This one does 12 damage per hit, which is pretty low, but it's okay for a starting weapon. This does 51 damage per second, which is okay as well. The damage per second can be good with the Recharger Rifle, although the practical damage per second with the Recharger Rifle is probably going to be lower than this, simply because you're going to fire this as many times as you can at an enemy, and then you're going to have to wait for it to recharge back up. So the damage per second is going to drop off more and more the longer the fight draws out, to where you're not going to be able to recharge this effectively, and you're probably just going to be shooting one laser at a time, waiting for it to recharge, at least into the early game. This one does 12 crit damage, which is pretty low as well, but it's the same as its regular damage, which is okay. This is a 1.5 times crit chance, so it's better than average. You're more likely to hit crits, so that's kind of nice. This one costs 19 action points, which makes it fairly good for the start for a VATS build because it doesn't cost that much. This one has 0.02 spread, so it is an extremely accurate weapon, one of the most accurate weapons in the game, about on par with something like the hunting rifle, which is actually really cool. That makes it so you have a pretty reliably consistent weapon at somewhat longer ranges if you're going with an energy weapon build and you get this early. This one holds 7 shots in it, and those 7 shots will recharge, but it will cap out at 7 shots. So it can't go any higher than that, which is what makes its DPS be pretty low, because once you fire out your 7 shots and you're going to have to wait so long for every shot to recharge after that. This one weighs a whopping 15 weight, which is really heavy. That's one of the heaviest rifles in the entire game. That's getting up there with like the 50 cal rifle and like the automatic rifle, which is pretty crazy. And this one is affected by the heavyweight perk. So if you want to carry around a Recharger Rifle, you could take that perk to cut its weight in half and have it go to 7.5 weight, which is still pretty hefty, especially for an energy weapon, but it's more reasonable than the 15 weight. You don't want to be carrying around multiple Recharger Rifles either. They are going to weigh you down a lot, and they're really not worth as much as other weapons. So kind of fix up your Recharger Rifles with other Recharger Rifles, at least into the early game. You could, of course, use them to fix other weapons if you have jury rigging later on. And then this one has 200 item health, which is pretty good for the start. That makes it so it does not break very fast. On my recent challenge run, where I was just going through and looting dead bodies and using them, or whatever they had on them as weapons, I did get a Recharger Rifle right at the very start, which actually saved me a ton of ammo in the early game, and made it so that my resources went much further as I progressed in that challenge. It by no means was a super strong weapon, but it was a really reliable early game weapon. Let's talk about the pros and cons to the Recharger Rifle, and then we'll go over some perks for it that may help it out a little bit. So for the general pros, infinite ammo is going to be the biggest pro of the Recharger Rifle. You never need to worry about ammo when you're carrying around the Recharger weapons, which is really, really cool, especially into the early game. The only other builds that have something like that are melee and unarmed, which are really strong early game builds too, but this does make it so energy weapons has a pretty reliable option into the early game to actually just save up ammo so that they can get more energy cells for whatever their pistol is and more microfusion cells for whatever their rifle is going to be. It also has good item HP, which is really good for the start. It makes it so it doesn't break very fast, which is awesome. Again, at the very start, you're not going to care about it so much later on when you can transition to other things like plasma and laser rifles, or some of the bigger weapons like the Gatling laser and the plasma caster. But in the early game, it's really nice. For the general cons of this though, low damage per second, and its weight is crazy. I don't know why it weighs so much. Weight makes it so you don't really want to be carrying around multiple of these. Carrying around one is fine though, because you're probably going to have an extra 15 weight that you can spare, at least on an energy weapon build. The low damage though, and the low damage per second really hurts as the game goes on, because you're just not going to have enough damage per second to kill things quickly. Even on like the lower difficulties, you can still struggle with the recharger rifle quite a bit. It's okay for medium-sized enemies and smaller enemies that you can pick off without too much trouble, which is why it's so good in the early game, but it falls off really hard as soon as you're out of that very early game. There are a couple of perks that do help with the recharger rifle though. You might think that laser commander would work with this weapon because it fires out lasers, but it doesn't according to the game's code, because it's not coded as a laser rifle, it's coded as a recharger rifle, so it uses recharger damage, which makes it so that laser commander does not affect it. I wish it did, because then it would get more crit chance, and that would help out at least some amount, but it doesn't, so that perk doesn't help. However, something like Meltdown does help with it, and that makes it so you can kill enemies, and when they're killed, they basically explode like a plasma grenade, and that makes it so damage per second can actually be upped quite a bit by this weapon, and it's okay for clearing up smaller crowds later on into the game. It's still not going to do amazing against big enemies, because you're still going to have to kill an enemy and then hope that that meltdown goes off and explodes, and it explodes close enough to the other enemies so that you can hurt them. But in the early game, it can actually be pretty decent, or for, again, just picking off smaller enemies like mole rats or something, it can actually be pretty decent. With all that being said though, for a rank with the recharger rifle, I would put this into F tier. It is probably one of the worst energy weapons in the game, sadly. It's really cool in the early game, and for early game, like inside Good Springs and just outside there, it would probably actually go up a little bit. It would probably actually be like a C or a D tier weapon where it's still usable. It's by no means crazy, but it can be kind of useful in that early game setting where ammo is scarce, you don't have very much money, and you just want something that has range that you can kill stuff with. It works really well then, but as soon as you move out of that and you start having like ammo for your other weapons and you start getting decent weapons, then it really doesn't have much of a niche anymore. So should you use the recharger rifle? Maybe, at least in the very early game, then potentially. If you don't find it in the early game, don't worry about it, and if you find it later on, you're probably not going to use it. So it's not one of the stronger weapons, it's probably on the weaker end of weapons, it's definitely in the bottom half of weapons, probably in the bottom 10 or 20 weapons total in the game, but still a really cool weapon, and I really like the design of the recharger rifle. Tell me your thoughts on the recharger rifle down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye, everyone.